She was dying in the snow, her fingers frozen around a letter from a man who never wrote it. Sienna Vincent had traveled halfway across the country to marry a stranger. She spent her last dollar on the journey. She had no family, no home, nothing to go back to. The letter promised her a new life, a good man, a real future. It was all a lie. A con man had used Preston Irwin's name to lure her west. But before the criminal could reach her, a blizzard struck. And by some miracle, the real Preston Irwin found her body half buried in a snowdrift. When she woke up and learned the truth, her world shattered. Then Preston did something no one expected. He looked at this broken woman who had been deceived using his name, and he said, "If you still want to be married, I'll honor the promise that was made." A stranger's lie, a rancher's honor, and a love story that would span generations. This story proves that love isn't always found where you expect it. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst betrayals. When life hands you deception, you can let it destroy you, or you can build something real from the ashes. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to believe that good things can come from broken beginnings. And subscribe so you never miss a story that could change your life. That brutal frozen wind sliced right through Sienna Vincent's coat, 1,000 icy knives against her skin. She pushed through the blinding white emptiness, clutching a letter to her chest, the very one that had pulled her all the way out to this God-forsaken country. When her legs finally buckled and the whole world turned sideways, she thought about what a fool she'd been. She had trusted the words of a stranger, just like her aunt warned her she would. Desperation, her aunt said, could make a fool out of anybody. 2 hours later, just as the sun started to bleed across the horizon, 3 cowboys on horseback saw a dark shape against the endless snow. Before the others even knew what they were looking at, Preston Irwin swung down from his mare. He dropped to his knees next to the woman, half buried in the snow, his heart pounding hard against his ribs as he wiped the frost from her face. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark eyelashes turned white and lips the color of a bad bruise. "She is alive," Preston called out to his friends. He pressed his fingers to her neck and felt a weak, fluttering pulse, but barely. "Thomas, get your coat off. Marcus, you ride for town and tell Doc Henderson we are coming in hot." Marcus spun his horse around and took off at a dead run, while Thomas climbed down and shrugged out of his heavy wool coat. Preston wrapped it tight around the woman and noticed her fingers were curled around something, holding on for dear life even as she slept. He gently worked her frozen fingers open and found the letter. The ink was smeared, but he could still make out the words. "What does it say?" Thomas asked, peering over his shoulder. Preston's eyes flew across the page and he felt his jaw tighten up. "It is an advertisement. Somebody put a notice in a newspaper back east, looking for a woman to come out west. There is a name written at the bottom." He looked up at Thomas, and his face was a stone mask. "My name? What in the world? You never put out no ad for a woman, I know that." Preston carefully folded the letter and tucked it inside his jacket before lifting the woman into his arms. She felt like she weighed nothing at all. He could feel her whole body shaking from the cold right through all the layers between them. "Help me get her up on my horse. We have to get her warm before she freezes solid out here." They rode hard for Leavenworth, Kansas, with Preston holding the woman close to his chest. He pushed his mare faster than was probably safe on the snow-covered trail. The town appeared out of the swirling snow like a ghost, its buildings all hunched over against the January wind howling down from the north. Marcus had done his job right. Doc Henderson was already waiting outside his office with a stack of blankets and a worried look on his face. "Bring her inside, hurry up," the doctor ordered, holding the door wide open. How long was she out in that mess? "There is no way to know," Preston said. He carried his small burden into the warm doctor's office. "We found her about 5 miles from town, buried in a snowdrift out by the old Miller place." Doc Henderson pointed him toward an examination table. The doctor started checking her right away while his wife, Sarah, heated up some water and gathered more blankets. Preston stepped back, just watching the doctor work with smooth, sure hands. The woman's face was still ghostly white, but a little color was starting to creep back into her cheeks now that she was out of that killing cold. "Do you think she will make it?" Preston asked in a low voice. "It is too soon to say for sure. She has a bad case of hypothermia, and I will not know about frostbite until she warms up some more." Doc Henderson looked at Preston over the top of his glasses. "You boys did a good thing, bringing her in when you did. One more hour out there, and we would be having a whole different kind of conversation." Sarah Henderson brought over a basin of warm water and started to gently clean the ice and snow from the woman's hands and face. That poor thing. What on earth was she doing out there all by herself? Preston took the letter from his jacket and gave it to the doctor. "She was holding on to this. Somebody used my name to get her to come out here." Doc Henderson read the letter, his face getting grimmer with every line. "This here is a marriage advertisement. It says that Preston Irwin of Leavenworth, Kansas is looking for a respectable woman of good character to come west and be his wife. It offers to pay for her travel and promises a good home and fair treatment." The doctor looked up, his eyes sharp. "You did not write this. I swear on my mother's grave I have never seen this letter before in my life." "Well then, somebody is playing a mighty dangerous game with your name." The doctor handed the letter back. "The only question is why?" Preston looked down at the woman on the table. He studied her face, now that it was not hidden by all that snow. She had a delicate face with a straight nose and a chin that looked strong. Even passed out and half frozen, there was something about her. "The question is who," he said quietly. "Who would do a thing like this, and what were they hoping to get out of it?" Just then the woman moved and made a small, pained sound. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Sarah Henderson gently stroked her forehead, making soft, soothing noises. "You just rest now, dear. You are safe." "I will stay," Preston said all of a sudden, "until she wakes up. She came all this way because of my name. Even if I was not the one who called her, that makes her my responsibility now." Doc Henderson gave a slow nod. "You suit yourself. Sarah will bring you some coffee. This could be a long night." It was long past midnight when Sienna finally opened her eyes. Preston had been nodding off in a chair right beside her. But some instinct woke him right up when the sound of her breathing changed. He leaned in closer as her eyes moved around under her lids, then slowly opened. They were the color of a stormy sky. "Easy now," he said softly when she tried to sit up. "You are safe. You are in Leavenworth, at Doc Henderson's place." Sienna blinked at him, with confusion and fear fighting on her face. Her voice was just a rough whisper. "The letter?" "I had a letter. I have got it right here." Preston took the folded paper from his pocket and held it so she could see. "Is this what you are looking for?" She stared at the letter so hard that something inside Preston's chest pulled tight. "You are him. Preston Irwin. I would have been too late, but the train got held up by the storm. Then the stagecoach driver said it was too dangerous to keep going, but I had already paid for the trip and I did not have anywhere else to go, so I started walking." Her voice trailed off and her brow wrinkled. "I fell. How did I get here? Me and my friends found you in a snowdrift about 5 miles out of town. You just about froze to death." Preston pulled his chair a little closer to her. "Miss, I have to tell you something important. I did not write that letter. I never put any advertisement in a paper looking for a wife. Somebody used my name, but it was not me." All the color that had returned to Sienna's face washed away again. "What?" "I am truly sorry. I know that is not what you wanted to hear, but it is the honest truth. I do not have any idea who wrote that letter or why they put my name on it, but I swear to you, it was not me." Sienna just stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned her face away. Preston saw her swallow hard. Of course. Of course it was not real. I should have known. My aunt told me I was a fool to trust it, but I thought maybe, just maybe. She pressed her lips together, fighting to keep it all in. "Hey now!" Preston reached out and gently turned her face back to him. "This is not your fault. Somebody played a cruel trick, and we are going to find out who and why. But right now you need to rest up and get your strength back. Doc Henderson says you are lucky to be alive. Lucky? Sienna let out a laugh that sounded bitter and broken. I spent my very last dollar to get here. I have no money to go back, no family to go home to, nothing. That is some luck. Preston felt something break loose inside his chest. A wall he had built up over the years suddenly had a crack in it. What is your name? Sienna Vincent. Well, Miss Vincent, here is what is going to happen. You are going to stay right here with Doc Henderson and his wife until you are all healed up. I am going to pay for your room and board, and I am going to find out who did this. After we know what we are dealing with, we will figure out what to do next. Is that fair? Sienna looked at him with those stormy gray eyes. Preston saw 100 different feelings pass through them before she finally gave a small nod. Why would you help me? This is not your problem. Somebody used my name to bring you to this town. That makes it my problem. Preston stood up and settled his hat back on his head. Get some rest now, Miss Vincent. I will come check on you tomorrow. He was almost at the door when her voice, small but clear, stopped him. Mr. Irwin, thank you for finding me, for not just leaving me out there. Preston looked back at her, and that tight feeling in his chest came back when he saw how vulnerable she looked. Any decent man would have done the same thing. You get some sleep now. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and the sky was starting to clear up. Preston stood on the doctor's porch, looking up at the stars peeking out from behind the clouds. Somebody in Leavenworth wrote that letter. They sent it back east using his name and his good reputation. The question was who, and more important, why pick on him? He thought about the woman sleeping inside, how she had held on to that letter even when she was dying in the snow. What kind of desperation would make a person travel halfway across the country to marry a total stranger? What was her life like back east that this seemed like her only choice? Preston shook his head and started walking toward his boarding house. Tomorrow he would start asking questions. Tonight he needed to sleep so he could think this whole puzzle through with a clear head. But as he walked through the quiet, snow-covered streets, all he could think about was finding the person responsible. Streets of Leavenworth, the face of Sienna Vincent was all he could picture. He kept seeing the way the light went out of her eyes when he had to tell her that letter was a complete fraud. In just a few short hours, something about that woman had burrowed deep inside him, and Preston had a sinking feeling his life was about to get a whole lot more complicated. The next morning arrived clear as a bell and cold enough to bite. Preston was up and moving before the sun, pulling on his warmest clothes and heading straight for the saloon, where he knew the coffee would be hot, black, and strong. An old-timer named Gus was wiping down the bar top when Preston stomped in. Gus looked up and said, "Heard tell you fellas found a woman nearly frozen solid outside of town yesterday." That was his way of saying good morning, as he poured Preston a steaming cup. News sure did travel fast in a place the size of Leavenworth. Preston cupped his hands around the warm mug and gave a slow nod. We surely did. She's alive, thanks to Doc Henderson. What in the world was she doing way out there? Preston took out the letter and laid it flat on the bar. Somebody wrote this thing and sent it back east. They used my name to lure her all the way out here with the promise of a wedding. Gus picked up the paper and read it over, his weathered face scrunching up into a deep frown. Now that is a low-down, dirty trick, even for this town. You have any notion who might have done it? That is exactly what I plan on finding out. You know just about every soul in this town, Gus. Who stands to gain by bringing a stranger here on a lie? And why on earth would they use my name to do it? The bartender stayed quiet for a good long while, his eyes looking off into the distance as he turned it over in his mind. Finally, he just shook his head. Cannot say I can think of anyone right off, but I will keep my ears open for you. Folks get to talking in a saloon, especially after they have had a couple of drinks. If somebody knows something, chances are I will hear the whispers. Preston thanked him and took his coffee to a corner table to think. Someone had gone to a whole lot of trouble to pull this off. They had written a letter that sounded real, figured out how to get it printed in a newspaper back east, and used just enough true details about Preston to make it all believable. That pointed to somebody who knew him, or at least knew about him. The door swung open, letting in a blast of frigid air, and with it came Sheriff Tom Garrett. The lawman saw Preston right away and walked over, a serious look on his face. "Heard you had quite a bit of excitement yesterday," Garrett said, pulling out a chair and sitting down without asking. "Doc Henderson told me all about that letter. Let me have a look at it." Preston handed the letter to him and watched the sheriff read every word. Garrett was a fair man. He was tough as nails, but honest, and Preston trusted his judgment more than just about anyone. "This is a real problem," Garrett said at last. "It is fraud, plain and simple. Could be something a whole lot worse, depending on what they were planning to do." "You think they wanted to hurt the young lady? Or was this all about making a fool out of you?" "I have been asking myself that same question all night long. I cannot figure out what anyone gets out of this. If they wanted to cause Miss Vincent harm, why in heaven's name bring her all the way out here to do it? There are far easier ways to hurt a person. And if the whole point was to get at me, why would they drag an innocent woman into the middle of it?" Garrett tapped his fingers on the tabletop. "Maybe it is not about hurting anybody. Maybe someone is trying to force your hand or hers to get one of you into a certain situation. Or it could be that somebody wanted this specific woman to come to Leavenworth for reasons we have not even thought of yet." That idea had not crossed Preston's mind, and it opened up a whole new world of troubling thoughts. "You think someone has specific plans for Miss Vincent?" "It is too soon to say for sure, but I want to have a word with her as soon as Doc Henderson gives the okay. Maybe she can tell us something about who might have sent that letter, or why someone would want to target her." Preston agreed, but he felt a strange hesitation about putting Sienna through more questions and suspicion. She had been through more than enough already. But he knew Garrett was right. They had to understand the whole picture if they were going to keep her safe and find out who was pulling the strings. They walked over to Doc Henderson's office together. They found Sarah Henderson in the front room, organizing her medical supplies. She gave them a warm smile, but her eyes were full of concern. "She is awake, and she ate a very good breakfast. Her color is much better this morning, though she is still quite weak. The doc says there is no lasting damage from the cold, thank the good Lord. Can we have a word with her?" Garrett asked. "I know she has been through a terrible ordeal, but the sooner we can get some information, the better our chances are of figuring this mess out." Sarah thought about it for a second, then nodded. "Just be gentle with her. She is trying her best to be brave, but I can tell she is frightened and heartbroken. Finding out that letter was a lie just hit her so hard." She led them into the back room. Sienna was sitting up in bed, wearing one of Sarah's nightgowns with a thick shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her dark hair was loose, framing her face, and Preston noticed for the very first time that it had glints of auburn when the light caught it just right. She looked up as they came in, and her eyes found Preston's immediately before moving nervously to the sheriff. "Miss Vincent, this here is Sheriff Tom Garrett," Preston said in a soft voice. "He needs to ask you a few questions about the letter and how you ended up here in Leavenworth." Sienna gave a slow, small nod. "All right." Garrett pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, making sure his posture was relaxed and calm. "Miss Vincent, I know this is hard for you, but I need you to tell me everything you can remember about getting that letter. Where did you first see it? Who gave it to you? Any little thing you can think of might be the key to helping us find out who is behind all this." Sienna took a deep breath. "I saw the notice in the Boston Evening Transcript about 2 months ago. It was in the personal notices section. I had been looking through the marriage advertisements because—" She stopped for a moment, a blush rising in her cheeks. "My situation was very difficult. I was working as a seamstress, making just enough to pay for a tiny little room. My aunt took me in after my parents passed away 3 years ago. But she remarried last year, and her new husband made it very clear that I was not welcome in their home. I had no other family, nowhere else to go, and no real chance of making things better for myself. So, you decided to answer the advertisement, Garrett prompted her gently. Yes. I wrote a letter to the address they provided, which was a post office box right here in Leavenworth. About 3 weeks after that, I received a reply. She looked over at Preston. The letter said you were a rancher, that you had a good home, and you were searching for a sensible wife who was not afraid of hard work. It also said you would send money for my travel to the post office there in Boston, and that I should come as soon as I could get my affairs in order. And the money arrived? Garrett asked. Yes, $50 in cash. It was more than enough to pay for the train ticket and the stagecoach fare. The letter that came with the money said I should try to arrive by January 15th, and to bring the original newspaper advertisement with me so you would know I was the right woman. Sienna looked down at her folded hands. I thought it all seemed almost too good to be true, but the money was real, and I was just so desperate to get away from Boston that I let myself believe it. Preston felt that little crack in his own chest get just a little bit wider. She had been all alone and scared with nobody to turn to, and some monster had used that against her for reasons they still did not understand. Did you tell anyone where you were going? Just my aunt. She tried her best to talk me out of it. She said I was being foolish and far too trusting, but my mind was already made up. I told my landlady I was leaving, and a few of the other girls I worked with, but I do not think any of them cared enough to wonder about it. Garrett leaned in a little closer. This is very important, Miss Vincent. In the weeks right before you saw that notice in the paper, did anything unusual happen to you? Did anyone seem especially interested in you, or ask a lot of questions about your life? Sienna frowned as she thought back. There was one man who came into the dress shop a few times. He claimed he was there to buy presents for his wife, but he always seemed much more interested in talking to me than in actually looking at any of the dresses. He asked a lot of personal questions, like where I was from, if I had any family, and what my plans were for the future. I just figured he was being friendly, maybe a little too forward, but I never felt like he was a threat. Can you describe him for me? He was tall, maybe around 40 years old, with light brown hair and blue eyes. He had a scar on his left hand. It looked like an old burn mark. And he spoke with an accent I could not quite place. It was not southern, but it was not northern either. It was somewhere in between. Preston and Garrett shared a quick look. That description could fit 100 different men. But a scar like that was a detail that could help them narrow it down. Do you remember anything else about him? Garrett asked. He told me his name was William something. He said he was a merchant and that he traveled a lot between different cities, buying and selling all sorts of goods, but now that I'm thinking about it, I never actually saw him buy a single thing from our shop. He would just look around for a while and talk to me. Then he would leave with nothing. Did he have any idea you were looking at marriage advertisements? Sienna's eyes grew wide. I never told him that. But one time he saw me reading the personal notices in the newspaper while I was on my lunch break. He made a comment about how those kinds of advertisements were dangerous, and that a woman could never trust what a stranger wrote in them. I remember thinking it was a very strange thing for him to feel so strongly about. Preston felt a coldness creep over him that had nothing to do with the winter air. That man was not warning her. He was checking his line, seeing if she was taking the bait. Trust those advertisements, maybe trying to get a feel for your answer or see just how bad you needed a way out. But why? Sienna asked, her voice getting louder. What does any of this have to do with me? I am just a regular person. I do not have a thing to my name. Why would anybody go through all this rigmarole? That is exactly what we aim to find out, Garrett said with purpose. He got to his feet and settled his hat on his head. Miss Vincent, you will be safe right here with Doc Henderson and his wife. Preston and we are going to do everything in our power to get to the bottom of this. In the meantime, you do not go anywhere by yourself. And if you happen to recall anything else about that fellow or anyone else who seemed mighty interested in you, you tell us right away. After the sheriff was gone, Preston stood for a moment in the doorway. Sienna was just looking down at her hands, a worried look on her face. He coughed just a little, and her eyes lifted up to his. I was serious about what I said last night, Preston told her. I am going to get this all sorted out, and I am going to see to it that you are looked after no matter what happens." "Why?" Sienna asked, and you could hear the honest confusion in her voice. "You do not even know me. This is not your problem to solve." Preston took a moment to think on that question. Why did he feel such a need to protect this woman he had just laid eyes on? It was more than just someone using his name, though that was certainly part of it. There was something about her, a quiet strength that she had even after being tricked and let down, that just pulled him in. "Let us just say I do not take kindly to seeing good people get hurt," he said after a bit. "And somebody used me to hurt you. That makes it my business." Through the next stretch of days, Preston split his time between looking into that strange letter and stopping by to see Sienna at Doc Henderson's place. She was getting better in a hurry, her natural grit showing itself as the color came back to her cheeks and she started moving around more. Sarah Henderson had found her some clothes to wear, and Preston couldn't help but notice that even in a plain cotton dress that was a little loose on her, Sienna held herself with a kind of grace that hinted she had known better days. "Tell me something about Boston," Preston said on the third day, sitting in the chair that had become his regular spot in her room. "What was it like for you growing up back there?" Sienna glanced up from the mending Sarah had given her to keep her hands occupied. It was crowded and loud. "My father worked as a clerk for a shipping company, and my mother brought in laundry to help us get by. We were not wealthy, but we had what we needed. I was even learning to play the piano before they passed." She gave a sad little smile. "That feels like a whole other life ago." "How did they pass typhoid fever?" "It tore through our part of town one summer, and in less than 2 weeks, they were both gone. I was 19 and all of a sudden on my own. My mother's sister let me stay with her, but she made it plain from the get-go that I was just another mouth to feed. When she got married again, her new husband said I had to find a husband of my own or get out. So I found a job as a seamstress and got myself a room, but the wages were awful, and I was always just 1 week of missed work away from being thrown out on the street." Preston felt a hot anger building up inside him at the thought of her struggling all alone with nobody to lend a hand. "You must have been scared to death." "I was, but I was also set on not winding up in some workhouse or worse. When I saw that notice in the paper, it felt like a sign from above. A chance for a fresh start somewhere new, with someone who actually wanted me there." She looked away for a second. "I should have known it was too good to be true." "You should have been able to believe that letter," Preston said, his voice firm. "This is not on you. You were brave enough to take a gamble on a better life. There is not a bit of shame in that." Their eyes met, and Preston felt a little jolt pass between them, a sort of shared understanding and closeness that made him hold his breath. Sienna was the first to look away, a blush creeping up her cheeks, but a tiny smile touched the corners of her lips. "Sheriff Garrett stopped by that afternoon with some news. I sent out wires to a few towns around here asking if anyone recognized a man like the one Miss Vincent described. I got a reply this morning from a sheriff over in Independence, Missouri. He said there was a man who fit that description perfectly, who ran a con game there about 6 months back. Called himself William Carter, went after women who were down on their luck, talked them into putting money into a made-up business venture, and then took off with their savings." "So he is a career swindler," Preston said. "But what is he after here?" "Sienna did not have any money for him to take." "No, but you do," Garrett reminded him. "You have got a prosperous ranch and money put away. Maybe the idea was to get her out here, make you feel like you had to help her, and then somehow use her to get to your cash. Or maybe he plans on showing up, claiming to be you, taking her as his wife, and then using her as a cover for some other kind of scheme." Preston frowned. "That all sounds mighty complicated." "Con men have complicated minds. That is how they manage to stay one step ahead of the law. But here is the real interesting part. The sheriff in Independence said this William Carter vanished after his whole plan fell apart. A few of the women he tricked filed complaints, but he was gone before they could catch him. Nobody has seen hide nor hair of him since, until he popped up in Boston looking for Sienna." Preston finished the thought. "Or maybe not. Maybe we are chasing a different fella altogether." I have got my deputies making the rounds, asking if anyone's seen strangers lurking about or asking questions about you or your ranch. If this Carter character or anyone working with him is in Leavenworth, we are going to find him." That night, sleep just would not come for Preston. He kept seeing Sienna in his mind, all alone in that blizzard, holding on to a fake letter and thinking she was walking toward a new beginning. The sheer desperation she must have felt to leave everything she knew and journey into the great unknown made his own chest hurt. And now she was stuck here with no way to leave and nowhere to go. The answer hit him sometime around midnight, so simple he could not figure why he had not seen it before. It was a risky idea and not at all ordinary, but then again, nothing about this whole mess had been ordinary. The next morning, Preston took his time getting dressed in his Sunday best and walked over to Doc Henderson's. He found Sienna in the kitchen with Sarah, helping get breakfast ready. She looked up as he came in, and her smile opened up that little crack in his chest into something that felt as wide as a canyon. "Mr. Irwin, you are up and about early. I need to have a word with you in private, if you do not mind." Sarah gave him a knowing glance, but she ushered them on into the sitting room and pulled the door shut. Sienna perched on the sofa's edge, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her curious eyes watching him. Preston paced back and forth for a second, trying to find the right words for what he needed to say. At last, he stopped and looked right at her. "Miss Vincent, I have a proposition for you, and before you give me an answer, I would ask that you hear me all the way out." "All right," Sienna said, a little hesitant. "You came all this way expecting to marry a man named Preston Irwin. That man, it turns out, was a fiction, made up by a criminal for reasons we are still trying to figure out. But I am Preston Irwin, the real one, and I am telling you that if you still have a mind to be married, I am prepared to make good on the promise that was made using my name." Sienna just stared at him, her mouth opening and then closing without a single sound coming out. At last she found her voice. "Are you asking me to be your wife?" "I surely am. I know this is all mighty sudden, and I'm well aware you don't love me. I don't love you either. Not yet, anyway. But I've spent these last few days getting to know you a bit, and I reckon you're a brave, strong woman, the exact kind who could make a good life out here. I've got a ranch that's doing fine, a house that's too big for one man, and I could purely use a partner. Not just someone to keep house or cook, but a true partner, somebody to share the work, the decisions, and whatever the future holds." "But you don't even know me," Sienna argued, "and I don't know you. What if we don't suit each other at all?" "That's a possibility," Preston admitted. "But marriages of convenience work out all the time so long as both people are set on making a go of it. We'd be starting with a better hand than most since we've at least met and had a talk. I believe we could build something real, given a little time and effort." Sienna got up and walked over to the window, staring out at the street all covered in snow. Preston watched her shoulders rise and fall with each deep breath as she clearly tried to wrap her head around what he was offering. "Why would you do this?" she asked, without ever turning around. "You could have your pick of any woman in this town. Why would you hitch your wagon to someone who was foolish enough to fall for a fake advertisement? Because I admire that you were willing to take a risk on something better. Because I have seen how you face being let down and scared with dignity and grit. Because in these few days I have known you, I have enjoyed talking with you more than I have enjoyed talking to anyone in a long, long time." Preston stepped a little closer, though he did not reach out to touch her. "And because I think the person who wrote that letter might have gotten the particulars wrong, but he was not wrong about one thing. I do need a wife. I have been on my own for too long, and while my ranch is making money, it feels empty. I want to build something that will last, and I get the feeling you want that too." Sienna turned to face him, and Preston was surprised to see tears running down her cheeks. "What if I cannot be what you need? What if I let you down? Then we can sort this out together. I'm not looking for perfection, Sienna. All I'm asking for is a chance." He offered his hand. "What do you think? Will you be my wife?" She stared at his open hand for a long time before she finally reached out to take it. Her fingers felt so small and warm inside his, and Preston felt that jolt again, that feeling of being connected. "Yes," Sienna whispered. Yes, I will marry you. They got married just 3 days later, right there in Doc Henderson's parlor. Sarah and the doctor stood up for them as witnesses, and Sheriff Garrett was there to give his blessing. Sienna wore a simple blue dress that Sarah had taken in to fit her, while Preston put on his best Sunday suit. The town minister led the service, and his voice was deep and serious as he talked about commitment, partnership, and making a life side by side. When Preston slid the ring onto Sienna's finger, just a plain gold band he'd picked up from the local jeweler, her hand shook a little. But she looked him square in the eye and said her vows loud and clear, promising to honor and cherish him for the rest of their days. Preston made the same promises back to her, and he meant every single word, even with his heart hammering in his chest, wondering what in the world they were doing. "You can kiss your bride," the minister announced. Preston leaned forward gently and pressed his lips to hers. It was a quick, proper kiss, but it still sent a rush of heat straight through him. When they stepped back, Sienna was blushing something fierce, and Preston could feel his own face getting warm. This was his wife. This woman he had known for less than a week was now his for life. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling all at once. After the little ceremony, they got into Preston's wagon to head out to his ranch. The Irwin spread was a good 8 miles outside of Leavenworth, tucked away in a valley with fine grazing pasture and a creek that flowed all year long. Preston had built the house with his own 2 hands over a couple of years, adding on new rooms whenever he could get the money for lumber. It was a plain place, but it was sturdy, made to stand up to the tough Kansas winters and the blistering hot summers. "It is not much to look at," Preston said as they got closer, all of a sudden worried about what Sienna would make of it. "But it is built solid and it stays warm." Sienna just gazed at the house with wide eyes. "It is wonderful, so much bigger than I ever imagined." Preston helped her down from the wagon seat and walked her to the door. The front door led right into the main room, which was the kitchen and living area all in one, with a big stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. On either side were 2 bedrooms and a little study Preston used for his ranch paperwork. "That room there is yours," Preston said, nodding toward the bigger of the 2 bedrooms. "I will be in the smaller one. I want you to feel like this is your own home, not like you are just visiting." Sienna looked over at him with clear surprise on her face. "We are not sharing?" A flush crept up Preston's neck. "Well, I reckoned we ought to take things slow, get to know one another a bit before before that part of married life." "But if you'd rather—" "No, not at all. That is very thoughtful of you," Sienna said right away. But Preston could have sworn he saw a flash of disappointment in her eyes before she looked away. Taking things slow seems like a good idea. They used the rest of that afternoon to get Sienna settled in. Preston gave her a tour of the house and the barns, and introduced her to his 2 ranch hands, Daniel and Robert. They lived in a little bunkhouse about 100 yards away from the main house. The men were both courteous and respectful, though Preston saw them give each other a look of surprise when he told them Sienna was his new wife. That evening, they sat by the fire after supper, the silence between them feeling comfortable instead of strained. Sienna was patching up one of Preston's shirts, her fingers moving fast and sure with the needle, while Preston was busy mending a leather harness. "Can I ask you something?" Sienna said, breaking the quiet. "You certainly can. Why did you never get married before now? You're obviously successful and well-respected. I can't believe you ever wanted for chances." Preston put the harness aside and gazed into the flames. "I was engaged one time, about 5 years back. Her name was Catherine. She was a beautiful and refined lady, the daughter of a rich merchant here in town. Everybody said we made a perfect pair. What went wrong? She decided she didn't want to be the wife of a rancher. It was too much work, too far from everything, and not enough high society for her liking. She broke it all off 2 weeks before the wedding day and married a banker instead. The last I heard, they'd moved to St. Louis. Preston gave a smile that had no humor in it. It taught me that pretty words and romantic notions aren't nearly enough. You need somebody who truly wants the life you can give them, not just the dream of it. "And you think I want this kind of life?" Sienna asked in a soft voice. Preston looked at her, really looked at her, noticing the way the firelight danced on her face and the gentle shape of her mouth. "I think you're strong enough to build whatever life you set your mind to. I hope you decide to build it right here with me, but I'd understand if you eventually decided this is not what you are looking for." Sienna put her sewing aside and came to sit next to him on the floor in front of the fireplace. "Preston, there is something you need to know. I did not just come out west because I was out of options. I came because I wanted a real adventure. I wanted to find out who I could be when I was not stuck under all the rules and expectations they have for women back in Boston. That letter, it offered me a shot at something real, something with meaning. And even though the man who wrote it was a liar, the opportunity is still right here. I decided to marry you, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had a feeling you were telling the truth when you said we could build something good together." "You really mean that?" Preston asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I do." Sienna reached over and took his hand, weaving her fingers through his. "I am scared. I am not going to lie about that. But I am also excited. I feel like my life is truly beginning right now." Preston squeezed her hand, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, on us." They sat just like that for a good long while, their hands joined, just watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. When they finally wished each other good night and went into their separate rooms, Preston lay awake for hours, thinking about the woman sleeping just on the other side of the wall. His wife. The word still felt unfamiliar, but more and more, it was starting to feel right. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Preston started teaching Sienna all about ranching, showing her how to look after the horses and the cattle, and how to read the signs of the weather in the sky and on the land. She was a quick study, always asking smart questions and jumping into the work with a surprising amount of grit. And in return, she completely changed the house, adding little things here and there that made it feel like a real home instead of just a place where a bachelor slept after a long day's labor. They got closer through the simple daily act of sharing meals and talking for hours, learning all of each other's little habits and quirks. Preston learned that Sienna hummed old songs her mother taught her when she worked. She found out that Preston liked his coffee so strong it could probably peel paint, and that he had a quiet, dry wit that would sneak up on her and make her laugh out loud. But they were still sleeping in different rooms, and aside from holding hands now and then, or Preston putting his hand on the small of her back to guide her through a doorway, they kept their distance. It was as if they were both holding their breath, waiting for some kind of signal that it was all right to take the next step in their marriage. That signal showed up about 6 weeks after they were married, when Sheriff Garrett came riding out to the ranch with some news. Preston and Sienna were out mending a stretch of fence when they spotted him coming down the lane. "Sheriff," Preston called out, putting down his tools, "what brings you all the way out here?" Garrett swung down from his horse and tipped his hat to Sienna before looking at Preston with a grim face. "We found William Carter, or what was left of him. A trapper stumbled on his body up in the woods about 10 miles north of here. It seems he froze to death right around the same time we found Miss Vincent, or I should say Mrs. Irwin." Sienna let out a little gasp and brought her hand up to her mouth. Preston wrapped an arm around her shoulders without even thinking, pulling her in close. "Are you sure it was him?" Preston asked. "It matches the description Miss Vincent gave us right down to the burn scar on his left hand. He had papers on him with the name William Carter, along with some mighty interesting letters." Garrett took out a folded piece of paper and gave it to Preston. "This was tucked in his coat pocket. I reckon you two need to see it." Preston carefully unfolded the letter, with Sienna peering over his shoulder to read it. It was written to a man named Marcus Thornton, and it laid out a whole scheme to use Sienna Vincent to get his hands on Preston's ranch and money. The plan was to get her out to Kansas, make Preston feel like he had to take her in, and then either have Carter marry her while pretending to be Preston, or just use her being there to make some kind of legal trouble for Preston's property. Marcus Thornton, Preston said slowly, the name ringing a bell. It ought to, Garrett said with a dark look. He is a lawyer who hung out his shingle in Leavenworth about 4 months ago. Seemed on the level, took care of a few small matters. But when we went to ask him about his dealings with Carter, we found out he had skipped town 3 days ago, cleaned out his office, and just vanished. So, Carter and Thornton were working together, Sienna said, her voice trembling. And their entire plan was to use me to rob Preston. That is how it looks. My best guess is that Carter was supposed to find you before you ever got to town. He would have likely claimed to be Preston and taken you to some fake ranch. Then Thornton would have drawn up a bunch of phony papers showing you were Preston's legal wife with rights to his land. They would have had you sign documents without you knowing what they were. Then they would have sold off everything they could get their hands on and disappeared before anyone was the wiser. But Carter froze before he could ever get to her. Preston finished the thought. And we got to her first. Exactly. Once you went and actually married Miss Vincent. Just like that, their whole crooked plan crumbled to dust. Thornton must have known he couldn't handle it by himself, so he just tucked tail and ran. Garrett gave Sienna a look full of understanding. You were never his real target, Mrs. Irwin. You were just a pawn they meant to use. I truly am sorry. After Garrett rode off, Preston and Sienna stood there in the quiet, letting everything sink in. Finally, Sienna's voice came out, barely a whisper. I am so very sorry, Preston. I'm the one who brought this trouble to you. No. Preston gently turned her to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. Carter and Thornton are the ones who brought trouble here. You were just as much their victim as I was about to be, maybe even more, since they were ready to use you up and likely get rid of you when they were done. You believe Carter was actually trying to get to me that day? That he was really out there in that blizzard searching for me? Most likely, and the storm found him first. Preston gathered her into his arms, feeling her shake against his chest. You're safe now. Both of them are gone. Carter is dead and Thornton took off. It's all over. Sienna held onto him tightly, her face buried in his shirt. I was so foolish. I should have seen right through them. You weren't foolish. You were scared and all alone. And they used that against you. But you made it through. And now you're here with me, and I promise you, I will never let another soul use you or hurt you like that ever again. She eased back just enough to look up at him, and Preston watched something change in her eyes. They were still damp with tears, but something new was in them now, something that made his heart beat a little faster. Preston, she whispered, kiss me. I mean it. Really kiss me. He sure didn't need to be told a second time. Preston cradled her face between his hands and brought his mouth down to hers. He kissed her with all the longing and fear and pure relief that had been building inside him since that first day. He found her half frozen in the snow. Sienna let out a soft sound and went up on her toes, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him back just as fiercely. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead on hers. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, he confessed. Me too, Sienna said with a shaky little laugh. What took us so long? I didn't want you to feel pushed into anything. I wanted to give you time to be certain about this, about us. I am certain. Sienna looked right up at him, her eyes clear and sure. I love you, Preston Irwin. Somewhere between you finding me in that snowbank and this very moment, I fell head over heels in love with you. And I have a feeling you might love me, too. I do, Preston said, and the words came out easier than he'd ever imagined. I love you so much it scares me half to death. When Garrett told us Carter was out in that storm, maybe hunting for you, it hit me how close I came to losing you before I ever really had you. That thought put more fear in me than anything has in years. They stood there holding each other as the sun dipped low over the Kansas plains, painting the whole sky in streaks of gold and deep red. At last, Preston took Sienna's hand and led her back toward the house. That night, she didn't go to her own room. She slept in his, right there in his arms, where she belonged. The months that came after were the finest of Preston's entire life. He and Sienna worked together on the ranch, building their life and their business. She turned out to have a real knack for numbers and took over the account books, finding clever ways to save money and make things run smoother that truly impressed Preston. Spring arrived in Kansas in a sudden burst of green grass and wildflowers, and one morning Sienna stood on the porch with a hand resting on her belly, a little secret smile playing on her lips. When Preston came in from his morning work, she looked at him with shining eyes. "I'm pregnant," she said, plain and simple. Preston crossed the room in 3 long steps and lifted her right off her feet, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to set her down. "For real, we're having a baby. For real, Doc Henderson confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. He figures the baby will arrive in early November." Preston gently set her back on her feet and put his hand over hers on her stomach, amazed by the new life growing inside her. "I just can't believe it. We're going to be parents." "Are you happy about it?" Sienna asked, with just a touch of worry in her voice. "Happy isn't a big enough word for it. I'm over the moon. Scared, sure, but thrilled." Preston kissed her gently. "You've given me everything, Sienna. A real home, a reason for it all, love. And now a child. I feel like the luckiest man on this earth." The pregnancy went along without a hitch, and Sienna just glowed with good health and joy. Preston doted on her and was protective, sometimes a little too much, until Sienna had to remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly fine to go about her day. That September, they got a message that Sheriff Garrett had finally tracked Marcus Thornton down out in California. The lawyer had been caught trying to pull the same con on some other poor soul and was going to stand trial for fraud and conspiracy. Preston sure hoped that man would spend a long, long time in a jail cell thinking about the lives he tried to ruin. November blew in with a crisp chill in the air and the hint of winter to come. Sienna went into labor on a cold, clear night with a whole sky full of bright stars overhead. Sarah Henderson came over to help with the birth, with Doc Henderson on standby just in case anything went wrong. Preston wore a path in the floor outside the bedroom door for hours, listening to Sienna's heavy breathing and the occasional cry of pain, feeling completely useless. At last, just as the sun was starting to break across the plains, he heard a new sound. It was the tiny, shaky cry of a newborn baby. Preston's knees felt weak with relief, and he had to hold onto the door frame to keep himself standing. Sarah opened the door a second later, her face one big smile. "You have a son, Preston. A strong, handsome son." Preston walked into the room and saw Sienna propped against the pillows, worn out but beaming, holding a little bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up when he came close, tears of pure joy running down her cheeks. "Meet your son," she whispered. Preston sat down on the side of the bed and looked at the tiny face peeking out of the blankets. The baby had a full head of dark hair and serious little eyes that seemed to be studying his father with great focus. Preston felt his heart swell up in his chest so big he thought it might just burst. "He's perfect," Preston finally said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're perfect. I don't know what I ever did to deserve all this, but I'll spend the rest of my days being thankful for it." They named him James, after Preston's own father, who had passed on when Preston was just a boy. Little James was a good baby, mostly calm and watchful, and he soon became the very center of their whole world. Preston found himself doing things he'd never pictured, like pacing the floor at 2 in the morning, humming lullabies and making silly faces just to get a smile out of his boy. Life fell into a new kind of rhythm, busier and a little more wild than before, but 1,000 times richer. The ranch kept doing well, and Preston brought on another ranch hand to help with the extra work, so he could have more time with his family. One evening in the early spring, when James was about 5 months old, Preston and Sienna sat on the porch watching the sun go down while their son slept in Sienna's arms. It had been more than a year since Preston had found her in that blizzard, holding a fake letter and nearly frozen solid. "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if I had been the one to write that letter?" Preston asked out of the blue. If it had all been real from the get-go, Sienna thought about it for a moment. "I suppose we would have ended up right here, but we would have taken a much straighter road. We would have skipped all the fear and the confusion and the doubt. But I'm not so sure we would be this strong. Going through all that mess together, choosing each other even when we had every reason not to, that made us solid in a way I don't think we would be otherwise. So what you're saying is you're glad Carter was a con man. I am saying I am glad I wound up with you no matter how it happened. The real you, not some perfect man I made up from a letter. And I'm glad you chose me for who I really am, not for some woman you imagined from her words on a page." Sienna rested her head on his shoulder. "We built something real, Preston. Something that's going to last." Preston put his arm around his wife and gazed out at the land that was his history and his son's future. The sky was on fire with color, with the plains rolling on and on toward the edge of the world. This life he had made, this family he had found by chance and kept by choice, was more than he had ever allowed himself to dream of having. "I love you," he said. "Simple as that, and just as true. I love you too," Sienna answered, tilting her head up for a kiss. The years rolled by as steady and sure as the changing seasons. James grew from a baby into a curious, wild little toddler, then into a smart young boy who loved the ranch and trailed after Preston like a second shadow. 2 years after James came along, Sienna gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Grace, who filled the house with even more laughter and commotion. Preston added on to the house to make room for their growing family, building new rooms and a bigger kitchen where Sienna spent hours teaching her daughters how to bake, while James helped Preston out with the horses. The ranch prospered under their care, becoming one of the most successful outfits in the whole area. On some evenings, Preston would stand out on the porch just watching his children play in the yard while Sienna hung the laundry or worked in her garden. He'd think back to that bitter cold day he found her, half frozen in the snow and clutching a letter for dear life. It made him realize how close they came to not having this life, this family, this love. When James hit 8 years old, Preston pulled him aside. He told his son the whole story of how he met Sienna, all about the fake letter, the blizzard, and the choice they made to build a life together, no matter how strange it all started. James listened, his eyes big as saucers, and then looked at his father with a serious face. "So, Mama came all this way to marry you, but you weren't the one who asked her, and you married her anyway," the boy asked, trying to piece it all together. "That's the long and short of it. I couldn't just let her come so far and have it all be for nothing. That was mighty good of you, Papa. I'm real glad you found her." Preston tousled his son's hair, his heart just about bursting. "Me too, son. Me too." By the time James was 10 and the twins were 8, the Irwin Ranch was the talk of Kansas, a place everyone looked up to. Preston had turned into a real pillar of the community, the kind of man other ranchers sought out for a word of advice. Sienna had even started a little school right there on their land, teaching not only their own kids, but a few from the neighboring ranches, too. They both believed that a good education was the way to a better life, and they celebrated their 10th anniversary with a big party that brought nearly the whole town out to their spread. There was fiddling and dancing and more food than you could shake a stick at. Preston held Sienna close while they moved to a sweet tune under a blanket of stars. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Sienna asked, laying her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday I was pulling you out of that snowdrift. Other times, it feels like you've always been right here, like my life never even started until you showed up. I know exactly what you mean. Boston seems like a whole other lifetime, like a story about somebody else. My real life started right here with you." Preston leaned back just enough to look deep into her eyes, which were still as gray and stormy as the day he first saw them open at Doc Henderson's place. "I'd do it all, over again. Every single second of being scared and not knowing what was next. It was all worth it, just to end up right here with you." "I am the man you were seeking," Preston whispered. saying the words he never got to say back then, but they felt right at home in that moment. Sienna just smiled, 'cause she knew exactly what he meant. You sure are. You were always the one I was looking for, even when I had no idea. They danced till the musicians' fingers were sore and they couldn't play another note, till their children were fast asleep on quilts in the cool grass, till the stars had wheeled clean across the sky and the night turned deep and quiet. Then Preston carried Sienna inside their house, the home they had built from scratch with nothing but grit, hope, and a whole lot of love. Life kept on, moving forward, bringing its share of happiness and heartache. Doc Henderson passed on in his sleep when James was 12 and Sarah went to live with her daughter down in St. Louis. Sheriff Garrett hung up his badge and a younger fellow took his place, though Garrett and his wife stayed good friends with the Irwins. Daniel and Robert both got married and started their own families, and their kids grew up right alongside the Irwin children. When James turned 18, he told everyone he was staying on the ranch to help Preston run the place, having no itch to go find his fortune somewhere else. The twins, now 16 and full of fire, had other plans. Emma wanted to be a teacher just like her mama, while Grace had her heart set on becoming a doctor. She was inspired by all the stories Sarah used to tell about Doc Henderson. Preston backed all their dreams, knowing the best thing he could ever give his children was the freedom to find their own way. He and Sienna had built more than just a spread with cattle. They'd built a legacy of love and of what was possible. One autumn evening, when Preston was in his early 50s and Sienna had just turned 50, they rode out to the very spot where he'd found her so many years before. The snow was long gone, of course, replaced by golden grass dancing in the wind. But Preston knew the exact place she'd been. Right there, he said, pointing with his chin. You were half buried, holding on to that letter like your life depended on it. Sienna swung down from her horse and walked over, brushing her hand through the tall grass. I truly thought I was done for. I was so cold I couldn't even feel my own feet, and all I could think was how foolish I'd been, how I'd tossed my whole life away chasing after some fantasy. Preston came up beside her and took her hand. But you didn't die. I found you, and we found each other. And just look at everything that grew from that one single moment. You still have that letter? Sienna asked out of the blue. Preston smiled a little. You know I do. It's in the drawer of my desk, right next to the first letter you wrote to that post office box and the one Carter sent back. I kept every last one. Why? Because they're part of our story. Even the parts that hurt, the parts built on a lie. They brought you to me, and I never want to forget that. Preston pulled Sienna in close, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. Every time I lay my eyes on those letters, I'm reminded of how doggone lucky I am. How easily it all could have gone the other way. They stood just like that while the sun dipped below the horizon. Two people who started out as strangers, thrown together by a twist of fate and a mean-spirited trick, who chose to build a life on love instead of convenience, and made something that would last longer than both of them. Their children would one day tell their own grandchildren the story of how Preston found Sienna in a snowbank and said he was the man she was looking for, even though he'd never sent for her. How two lonely souls took a cruel joke and turned it into a love story that would stand the test of time. The years kept on rolling by, soft and quick. Preston and Sienna grew old side by side, their hair turning silver, then snow white, their pace getting slower, but the love between them never faded one bit. They watched James marry a sweet girl from town and start a family of his own. They beamed with pride at Emma's success as a teacher and Grace's hard-won place at a medical school back east. When Preston turned 65, he started handing the reins of the ranch over to James bit by bit, though he still rode out every single day to look things over and offer his 2 cents. Sienna kept on teaching until she was in her 70s, finally retiring when her eyes started to give her trouble, and reading became a chore. They spent their days together, sitting on the porch, watching their grandkids run and play, telling old stories and dreaming about the time they still had left. Preston made darn sure Sienna knew every single day just how much he loved her. How thankful he was that a strange twist of fate had brought her right to his doorstep. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family came together at the ranch to celebrate. There were dozens of folks there by then, children and grandchildren and all sorts of family, all of them connected by the love that Preston and Sienna had built from thin air. James stood up to make a toast, with his own kids gathered right there beside him. "To my mom and dad," he said, raising his glass high. They proved that sometimes love doesn't show up the way you think it will. But when it does, you grab on with both hands and you never let go. Thank you for showing us all what a real partnership is, what true commitment really means. Happy anniversary. Everyone drank and cheered, and Preston felt a little sting in his eyes. He looked over at Sienna and saw the same feelings on her face, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "We did all right for ourselves, didn't we?" he whispered. "We did better than all right," Sienna answered back. "We did magnificently." That night, long after everyone else had gone home or was tucked into guest beds, Preston and Sienna lay together like they had for 3 decades. Sienna's head was on Preston's chest, his arm holding her close, their legs all tangled up in that easy way that comes from years of habit. "Do you remember what you told me that very first day after I woke up at Doc Henderson's place?" Sienna asked in a soft voice. "I said a whole lot of things that day. You said I was brave, that taking a big risk for a better life took real courage, and that there wasn't any shame in it. Do you still believe that?" Preston kissed the crown of her head, taking in the familiar smell of her hair. "I believe it every single day. You were brave back then, and you've been brave every day since. Brave enough to build a new life with a complete stranger. Brave enough to love me, even when I was being difficult or just plain stubborn. Brave enough to make this ranch a real home, and to raise our children to be decent, good people. I'm just in awe of you, Sienna Irwin. I couldn't have done a single bit of it without you. You saved me, Preston, in every single way a person can be saved. We saved each other," Preston corrected her softly. "I was just walking through life before you got here, doing what I had to do but not really living. You woke something up in me. You made me want to be a better man, to do better things. Every good thing in my life grew from you." They fell asleep just like that, held tight in each other's arms. Two souls who had found one another against impossible odds and held on through every storm life threw their way. Preston and Sienna lived long enough to see their 40th anniversary, a blessing they celebrated quietly, with just their children and grandchildren. By that time, Preston's health was getting frail, his heart growing a little weaker each year. But he was a stubborn man, determined to soak up every single moment he had left. He possibly could with the woman who had turned his whole life around. When Preston finally passed on at the age of 72, it was quiet and peaceful in his sleep, with Sienna holding his hand. She was heartbroken but not shattered. She found her strength in their children and grandchildren, and in the legacy of love they had made together. Sienna lived for another 5 years, filling her days with her family, and keeping Preston's memory bright with the stories she told. She never married again, always saying that she had found her one great love, and one was enough for any lifetime. When Sienna's time finally came, she passed peacefully in the very same bed she had shared with Preston for all those years. Her final words were for James, who sat by her bed, holding her hand just as she had held his father's. "Tell them," she whispered, her voice faint but clear. "You tell your children and their children about how your father found me in a snowbank, how he gave me a chance when he had no cause to, how we built all of this from nothing more than grit and love. Tell them that real love isn't about perfect situations or grand romantic gestures. It's about choosing somebody every single day, even when it's tough, especially when it's tough. I will, Mama. I promise." Sienna smiled and closed her eyes. And James would have sworn he saw his father's face in the shadows, reaching out to take her hand and guide her home. They buried Sienna right next to Preston, under a big spreading oak tree on a hill that looked out over the ranch they had built side by side. The entire town came to the funeral, which showed just how many lives she had touched. James and his sisters stood at the graveside with their children and grandchildren all around them. Every one of them was connected by the love story that had begun with a deceitful letter, a snowbank, and a cowboy who had said he was the man she was looking for. In the years that came after, the Irwin Ranch kept on prospering under James's care, and later on under his sons. The story of Preston and Sienna became a family legend, told and told again at every gathering and celebration. It was a reminder of where they all came from, and the values that had built their family. The letters that Preston had kept were preserved with great care, handed down through the generations like precious family treasures. Each new generation would read them and be amazed at how differently things could have gone. How a mean-spirited trick had been turned into a lasting love by the choices of two courageous people. On the wall of the main house, which had been added onto and modernized but never moved from its original spot, hung a painting of Preston and Sienna that was done when they were in their 40s. In it, they stood together on their porch, his arm around her shoulders and her hand covering his on her waist. Both of them were looking at something out of frame with faces full of contentment and love. Underneath the painting was a small brass plaque that James had made, engraved with words that perfectly captured their story. She came seeking a promise. He offered a choice. Together, they built a legacy that will endure for all time. And it did endure through the generations that came after, through the changing times, and as the West changed from a wild frontier into a settled land. The Irwin family stayed rooted in Kansas, on the land that Preston had worked, and that Sienna had turned into a home. Their love story was a foundation that could never be shaken. In the end, it never mattered that the letter had been a lie. What mattered was that two people had looked at one another in the face of impossible circumstances and said yes. Yes to what was possible, yes to being partners, and yes to love in all its messy, complicated, and beautiful truth. Preston had found Sienna in a snowbank, clutching a letter, and he had told her he was the man she was looking for. In saying that, he had spoken a truth that was deeper than either of them could have possibly known at that moment. He was exactly the man she had been searching for, not the make-believe person described in Carter's phony advertisement, but the real man with all his faults and his strengths and his great capacity for love. And she had been exactly what he needed, even though he hadn't known he needed her until she showed up in his life like a gift from a very unlikely place. Together they had taken a tragedy and a deception and made it into something beautiful, and that would last. Their story became a living proof of the power of choice, of the courage it takes to build a love instead of just waiting for it to show up fully formed. It proved that the best love stories aren't about perfect meetings or ideal situations, but about imperfect people choosing to be perfect for each other. The West changed and grew up, but the story of Preston and Sienna Irwin stayed the same, a bright thread woven through the fabric of their family's history. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled across the Kansas plains and the snow started to fall, the Irwin descendants would gather around the fire and tell the story one more time. They would talk about the fake letter in the snowbank. They would talk about the cowboy who kept a promise that he had never even made, and about the woman who was brave enough to journey into the unknown just to find a better life. They would talk about how love can show up in the strangest of places if you're just willing to be open to it. And they would remember that sometimes the greatest love stories don't start with love at first sight, but with a simple choice to give love a chance to grow. Preston and Sienna had made that choice, and by doing so, they had created something that would live on long after they were gone, a legacy of love that would last as long as there were Irwins to remember and honor it. The ranch is still there, generation after generation working the land and adding their own chapters to the family story. But every bit of it traces back to that winter day in 1878, when Preston Irwin found a woman half frozen in a snowbank and decided that his honor required him to keep a promise he had never made. In that single moment, though neither one of them knew it yet, their true story had started. Not the story written in Carter's deceitful letter, but the real story of two people who built a life and a love that would become a legend in their family for all the generations to come. It was a story of courage and choice, of honor and grit, of taking what life dealt you and making something beautiful out of it. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy Preston and Sienna Irwin left behind. It was not just the land or the ranch or the worldly success they had found. It was the knowledge that love, real love, is something you build with your own two hands and your heart, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until all of a sudden you look around and you realize you've created something that will last forever. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.